what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about collecting your own data. And we're going to talk about methods that we use to do that, to collect that data. And then we're going to give you some of the mechanics of collection and analysis. And you may be thinking, oh, you know, it's a lot of work. I don't know if I can do that. We're going to kind of sort through that and talk about any concerns that you have when we're talking about primary data collection. So Jared, I think you have a poll for us. We want to know a little bit more about you as we get started. Jared?
T, I'm sorry, it's not coming up for some reason.
Oh, okay. Well, I tell you what, we're all savvy, experienced educators, so we always have another method in our back pocket, right? So let's just go to the chat box. And if you all would just put in the chat box, give me an idea of the level of experience that you've had in conducting needs assessment. You can, you know, use words like I'm a beginner, or I've had some experience, or quite a lot of experience. We just want to get a sense of that in the room today. Okay. See very little, beginners. Some, exactly, Becky. Becky said she's had experience over the years, but learned something new each time. Me too. Community health needs assessments. Yep, limited. Beginner. Okay, so we do have a continuum of experience here, but a lot of people who are just beginning. So what we want you to do is, I think we're still a small enough group that we can, you can type your questions in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself, come on in through audio and ask us a question, and then we'll save a little bit of time at the end also for Q&A. I've had quite a bit of experience working with educators over the past 10 years in needs assessment. And there's something else I want to tell all of you. I'm using the word educators generically because in my view, all of us who work for Extension are educators. And so I'm using that for ease of discussion. We're all educators and we refer to all of us as educators. So let's move on. And my system is moving really slow for some reason.
It's probably just because you bragged on your internet speed this morning.
It was Murphy's Law, Debbie. You're exactly right. Debbie and I were having that discussion, and she's had problems with her internet. And I'm like, oh, no, mine's really good. But it's a little slow right now. So one of the things that I wanted to start out talking about is that I look at when we talk about collecting primary data, I think of it as a continuum. And there's all the way on this left-hand side, it's what I'll call anecdotal. And then on the right-hand side, it's research-based. And that is a continuum. It's not either or. And there are places and times for both the anecdotal and then for the research-based. And a lot of that is driven in terms of where you're at on that continuum. But what's the level of evidence do you need? Do you need some hardcore research evidence to take, I don't know, to funders or others? Do you just need some snippets from, you know, appreciation letters or emails that you want to be able to talk or help describe your program a little bit? So on both of those, we're going to talk about how that's gathered. What are the methods? And we're going to talk about how you can decide what kinds of evidence that you need. So, as I said, this is a whole continuum that runs here from the anecdotal to the research-based. And I think those decisions are, it's a combination of several things that determines where you're at on that continuum. So what is that need for evidence? Is that need in your P&T, in your promotion and tenure? Is it for grants? Well, if that's the case, we know we're going to be a little bit further on that right side than we are on the left side, because in those situations, anecdotal evidence is just not strong enough. It doesn't have the strength enough to convince people of our argument. Also, and you all know that I came out of the Maryland system, so a lot of my experience over the past decade has been with Maryland. So if I use the wrong term when I'm talking about P&T or scholarship, or say something maybe that's incorrect here in Ohio, my colleagues are going to help me out with that. But one of the things in Maryland, which was a heavily promotion and tenure for field-based faculty, heavily promotion tenured system, a lot of call for scholarship. And so those scholarship pieces, of course, absolutely pushed us over to that research-based primary data collection, systematic of doing needs assessment. And then I had this on here, but that was also a push. If you're going to publish, having that scholarship and being able to publish, you've got to have some of that hardcore data. There are times, the secondary data today is so great from when I started out. The census data, they're providing great visualization. There's all kinds of data out there you can find out about your community. There's community fact sheets and so on and so forth. And that's all great, but sometimes the secondary data is just not enough. You need more depth to the information, and you need some more specificity. Also, where you're at maybe in your program planning, where your program is at in its particular phase and maturity. If you have a very mature program, you might be pushed to the left side more in terms of more anecdotal information that shines some light on that program, pieces of that program. It could be if you're just beginning development of a program, you're going to fall kind of in the middle on this continuum. We'll talk about those methods and strategies in a little bit. But a lot will depend on where your program's at. Also, a lot depends, quite frankly, and realistically, on money. Now, I have run paper-based surveys we did on the eastern shore of Maryland. It's 9 counties, heavily agricultural, heavily poultry, and agronomic as well. But we had to go paper-based because at that point, we just weren't comfortable, and probably wouldn't be today either, that sending it out via an electronic link would get the response that we need. Our farmers, producers, growers, they still wanted that paper-based survey. When all was said and done, it cost us in just outright dollars, about $5,000 to run that. And that was driven by postage, totally by postage. So it can be expensive if you can go electronically sometimes with collecting primary data. It's in a survey, it's much less expensive. So money can be a determining factor. And of course, not counting in direct cost of that was just our time as well in terms of putting all that together. Time was my next bullet point. Depending on how much time you have, if it's a research-based project, it's going to take more time. As the further along that continuum it falls, the more involved it gets. Time can be time for IRB approval, to get all of that together, to go through the review process, and then get your implementation done. But one of the things, too, falling along this continuum that we don't often think about is that, where do you want to be with that community engagement? And where do you want to be with that community marketing piece? And this was several years ago. I was in a qualitative workshop with one of our gurus in evaluation, Michael Quinn Patton. And what he said during that workshop, and it stuck with me, has really informed my practice since then. He said, every survey, every evaluation that you do is actually an educational piece. So when you're writing a survey and you're crafting questions or you're talking to a key informant, there is a level of education that is taking place with that person. And I always think about that every time I write a survey today or write a protocol. I think about them as educational pieces. I also think about them as marketing oftentimes, and I'm going to give you an example a little bit later on. of some new FCS educators in Maryland who are getting started. And it very much what we did with needs assessment, collection of primary data, was also marketing for extension as well. So when we talk about anecdotal evidence, I mean, really what we're talking about is that type of data that is not systematically collected. It can be random. Oftentimes it could be from people we know or we don't know. That can come in through emails. It can come in through social media posts. It can be part of conversations. And again, not to dismiss that, because anecdotal information does have its place. I had spoke of Michael Quinn Patton, who is an evaluator, very well known. He will sometimes argue that stories are anecdotal, and that's just fine as an evaluation method. I'm going to go over to the right-hand side again, and on that continuum, when we talk about research-based methods, there's particular language that we use. So when I talk about focus groups, and I talk about key informant interviews in a research world, that has meaning in terms of how I'm going about that. And whether that's also case studies, direct observation, we tend not to use a lot of that in extension, although I have used it. It's often very good tool to use with youth audiences. And then surveys as well can be both, which are primary data collection and can be both qualitative and quantitative. But right there in the middle is what when I worked in the county, this is really where I did a lot of my needs assessment and understanding and listening to the community. Not using research methods oftentimes, but not calling them a research project, right? So in our language in extension, in evaluation, I will talk about listening sessions where I'm going out and I'm listening to people. But I'm being strategic about those listening groups and making sure I'm getting geographic coverage, making sure I'm getting the socioeconomic coverage that I need to, so that I'm really getting all of the community involved. Big town halls, I've done big town halls as well, big community forums. And then moving to the other side of that, one-on-one interviews. Again, using some of the same tools that we use in research, and I'm going to show you some of those, like a protocol or a discussion guide. You know, in research, we talk about protocols, you know, kind of here in a less formal way, and so that people aren't intimidated, you know, and talk about a discussion guide. And again, case studies, observations, and surveys. You know, one of the problems that we have in evaluation, and I think in research too, is the language we use. So one of the things that I have tried purposefully and intentionally in my practice is, when I can, to stay away from some of that language and put it in more plain language. One of the things I do want to say, as we move further to that right-hand side of that continuum, that research-based, that's really when here's the big difference. We're getting into human subjects research. And when you're into human subjects research, that means you're going to your IRB folks, the committee, and it has to be reviewed. It has to be IRB approved. Have done a ton of that work over the years. I know people find that intimidating, but there's lots of help, lots of support for that. If you do get into a position or into a project where you really want to make it a research-based project, it looks pretty scary from the outside, but it's not that bad. And that's really a critical point. If for scholarship purposes, if for P&T purposes, you want to take that community needs assessment and push it over so that you get the research so that you can publish. Because if you want to go into a journal, or even if you're doing poster presentations or that sort of thing, my rule of thumb was always to have an IRB review. And they'll tell you whether it's exempt research or whether it's expedited and all of that. So just a little bit to say about that. Debbie has experience here at Ohio and probably could answer some more specific questions about that. Okay, Debbie, I think we're back to you now.
All right.
Okay.
So you should see, can you see the screen? The slide should be back up.
Yes,
I'm just noticing to you that it looks like you don't have the same fonts on your computer that I have, so.
I should go to a session on branding.
No, I think it's fine. All right. 1 second, I'm gonna open up my chat box. Okay. So when we have, we're talking about focus groups and listening sessions. That's what I'm gonna delve a little bit deeper into. First of all, can I get from the crowd, what do you guys think a focus group is? If you could share in the chat box. What do you know about focus groups? Anybody? Bueller? Group of people assessing a situation. Small group of people. Anybody else?
Got a select group.
Mm-hmm.
A comment, Debbie, that oftentimes they're skewed. Somebody else
Okay.
said targeted. Group of people focusing on one thing. Random
Sharing
selection of
ideas.
people, sharing ideas.
Okay. And then also in the chat box, how many of you have tried focus group interviews or have used focus group interviews as a method to collect information from your communities? You can do like show of hands on the participant list or just raise your hand in on your video feed. You've been in one, Ruth, okay. So we have some various exposure and experience with focus groups. Okay. So if you could let me know if there's any questions in the chat because I just closed it. So it's usually a group discussion for about 1 to 2 hours. We like to say keep it to like 1.5 hours. We employ a trained moderator, facilitator. We need to have that trained person to lead that discussion and ask those questions, which we have a predetermined questioning route. We like to say, typically we don't want to ask more than 6 to 9 questions. That usually takes about 1.5 hours of people's time. Unless you're talking to kids, they can be either fast talkers or they just don't have as much information to share. But you do have that predetermined questioning route set up. And there's also a formal analysis of the data involved, and that happens after the focus group interviews. And then we also are looking for some type of pattern or trend, both within a group and then across groups, because the focus group interview project does entail more than one group of people. So those might occur sequential in time, or they might be occurring at the same time. Typically, though, it's one group after another. Usually we like to say on different days because it can be taxing to be a focus group moderator because you have to be on your game and you have to be paying attention to what is being said by everyone in the group. So now that we know a little bit about focus groups, when do you think you would use this method for assessing your community? If you want to share in the chat box or open your mic. or when have you used them? You want to determine what the needs are in a community.
Debbie, when I worked for our local YWCA, we used it for future planning and transitioning of the Y, what the focus was. And that was mainly staff and board members, but we did break down into those focus groups. And because I was in childcare, I focused on that one area. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Becky Nesbitt has said perhaps to get more nuanced information than in a survey. And yes, that is a very good reason to use focus group. When you're at the beginning stages of a project and you're just trying to lay the groundwork for what are the needs in a community, that's also a very good time to use a focus group. So some of the advantages and disadvantages. Advantages of focus groups, it does give you a lot of really good information and ideas. It allows for clarification. The process of doing a focus group, unlike a survey, you can ask a probing question or a follow-up question to get more information. You can actually see if a person has understood the question that you're asking them. The results are pretty easy to understand because we're talking about words. We're not talking about like a correlation coefficient that maybe people don't understand. They can be inexpensive, but they can also be kind of quick to do. There is a time investment for you as the researcher or the person conducting the focus group. But once you have invested that time into like recruiting your participants and figuring out the questions, et cetera, the time from between, conducting the focus group interviews to being able to analyze and share results can be a reduced time frame. We've had experience in the past, worked with United Way. They asked for some information, like to do a focus group project with them on December 3rd, and we had information for them by December 22nd. So very quick turnaround time, it can be. You can also increase the sample size as necessary. For example, you might do 3 focus group interviews and then figure out that you're not seeing any more new information, so you don't have to conduct any more focus groups. But you could plan for up to like 5, for example. And then if you find after 5 focus groups, you're still finding new information, because we tend to conduct these focus group interviews until we don't find any new information. So you can always schedule some more focus group interviews. So some of the disadvantages, the researchers have a little less control. That's not too bad because a lot of the times you get them into a room and kind of the people that are participating in the focus group interview can like feed off of each other. Somebody might say something and then somebody else will think of an instance in their own mind about something similar that happened to them or what they need. You do need to have a well-trained moderator to conduct the focus group interviews. It just runs better. Sometimes it can be difficult to recruit people to participate in the interview. And then you might have somebody that dominates the conversation when we have a focus group interview. But a lot of these disadvantages can be controlled if we have a trained moderator conducting that focus group interview.
Hey, Debbie.
Oh, yeah.
Could you just talk just for a minute about incentives for focus groups at OSU? Is there a process for that if you want to use incentives? Like cash?
You mean to get your participants involved or to recruit people?
To recruit, like, oftentimes with focus groups we say, oh, come, we'll give you dinner and we'll give you $25.
Yes, we can do that. And when we talk about the audience, but yes, you can recruit people by using food. That's one method. Also, recruiting people, for example, if you recruit someone who maybe has experience with your programming in the county, but then also have that person bring a friend who doesn't have any experience. So kind of like that goodwill between people, or, you know, bring a friend to a focus group. That can sometimes help you get more people involved in your focus groups. But yes, we are allowed to provide incentives. So almost half, a third to half of the time setting up a focus group interview project is planning that process. So we want to be able to, and Richard Kruger is the big guru on focus group interviews. So if you ever want to learn more about focus group interviews, definitely look up his information. So that it's definitely a qualitative approach that we're trying to gather information. There are, so your planning time though it's kind of like your first 3 steps in the process. We want to make sure you consider your process and put that your purpose of the focus group interview, and put that purpose in writing. It can help you later on when you're trying to analyze those results and figure out how you're going to report those results. Also consider who's going to be using that information. What is it that they want to know about? So if it's you, then you should know what you want to know. You know what you want to discover. But if you're doing a focus group interview for someone else or another organization, consider that information that the users want in the long run, or your stakeholders want to know. Then also develop a tentative plan for that focus group interview, including process, including the chronological, like a timeline, and then also what it's going to cost. Like, are you going to offer incentives to people? And how are you going to pay for that? How much is it going to cost? And then how much time are you going to plan for the different groups that are getting together? So that's like a third of the process. Then we have to identify questions. So T is going to talk a little bit later more about open-ended questions. But definitely when you're doing a focus group interview, you have an established set of questions. You want to highlight those key questions, establish the context of your project for the people that are participating in the focus group. Arrange them in a logical sequence. You want to start off with more unstructured questions and move to more focused questions, hence the term focus group. And then also make sure, it might be tempting, but do not send that questioning route, that list of questions. Don't send it to the participants before they get together and start talking. Because you want them to, you can share the purpose with them, but don't share the specific questions with them. Because you want them to have genuine reactions, not to have forethought about what the questions are or what their answers might be. It's best if you can memorize those questions, but if you can't, that's not a problem. Just make sure you have those written out. And it's a good idea to also have the probing questions written out to the best of your ability. Once you get in the room, you might come up with some additional probing questions. But typically you want to have those questions ready. That first question that's probably going to be asked, you're gonna want to ask of everyone in the room. So it's kind of like an icebreaker question. But then from then on out, unlike some other types of methods, people can participate in answering the questions as they feel they have an answer to give. So if someone is not responding to a question, that's fine. And then since it is like a project, you're going to be asking the same questions of several different groups of people. Try to make sure that you ask all of the questions in your questioning route of each group. Don't ask three of your questions to one group and then all 9 of your questions to another group. Try to get through the entire questioning route. So when we want to identify the audience, well, like we were just talking about, it's a good idea to, if you can offer incentives, and sometimes that's just, you know, a pizza or a meal or something like that. You usually want about 6 to 12 people in a focus group interview. Optimum is like 8. you probably shouldn't go more than 12. When we're talking about recruiting people for our focus groups, we're usually talking about a purposeful sample. We have a group of people that we're targeting. They have a knowledge about some information that we want, and that's what we're targeting. So that's who we're going to target to participate in our audience. Make sure once you have recruited those people that you have constant communication with them. You send them the invitation, then once they RSVP that they can attend, make sure you are following up with them on a constant basis before the interview actually happens, to make sure that they remember to come, tell them, you know, the location, try to have a location set up that's kind of like a neutral location, and that type of thing. So when we actually conduct the focus group, again, we continue to conduct focus groups until we are not finding any new information. So no new information is provided, you could probably stop conducting the focus groups. Now, if you've already set up and scheduled and invited and gotten people to respond that they will come to 5 groups and you stop finding new information at 3, go ahead and conduct those other 2 focus groups, because you want to keep the goodwill of the people that have agreed to come and participate, so you can still listen to them. Make sure that when you're conducting a focus group that you record the session, audio recording. Usually we don't do a video recording of a session, but definitely audio recording, and let them know that the reason that it's being recorded is so that you can get a transcription. It's also a really good idea if you can employ someone, not necessarily paying them, but to recruit somebody to be an assistant moderator. It's always nice to have someone else in the room so that you as a moderator can pay more attention to the people that are responding to your questions, and you can like have direct eye contact with those people, etc., so that they know that you're listening to them, and then you can have an assistant moderator who's kind of like taking and jotting notes for you. Or like we like to say, quote taking. So if someone you know, has a really good quote, have that assistant moderator write down quotes for you as you're doing the process. And then, as T mentioned, these are typically more formal process, so we probably want to contact the IRB and make sure that if you need to have an IRB approval, that you have that. Sometimes the focus group interviews can be considered exempt research, so that process is a lot quicker than the full IRB application process. And if you need some help with that, we can help with that. So I have just a few tips to share for moderators, because there are many. And there is an art to moderating a focus group. So like I said earlier, you have to make sure that you're physically alert during the entire process of the interview, and that you're actively listening, so they know that you're paying attention to what they're saying. You need to ask probing questions when necessary. It's nice as people are coming into the room, if you can start like some small talk or conversations with people before the actual session starts. However, don't start to, if they ask, you know, what questions are you going to ask? Don't answer that question, but try to make some small talk. The small talk in the beginning, it does help you kind of identify, especially if you're not very familiar with the group, the dominant versus the shy people in the group. And can anybody give me a guess of where we would place the dominant versus shy people for in our room, at our table? Because we typically have a table with chairs around it. People are more comfortable when they're sitting at a table, even if they don't have any notes or anything like that to take, but people are typically more comfortable. So where might you think we would put a dominant person in relation to the moderator? Because the moderator is also sitting at the table. Anyone? Put the shy person closest to the moderator. the dominant person farthest. So Christina, actually, I've heard the exact opposite, and here's why though. The shy person, if you put them right next to you, you cannot, as a moderator, you can't make any eye contact with that person. So making eye contact with a person, it generally helps them feel more comfortable and feel like they want to talk. Whereas the dominant person, if you place that dominant person right to your either your right or your left, if they start to take over the conversation, you can actually, not to be rude, but to turn away from them just a little bit to try to engage some other people that might be across from you to get their attention and try to pull them into that conversation. Because we want to try to avoid one person taking over the entire conversation. And sometimes it's a good idea if there are some pre-existing relationships going on with that group, it's usually better if we don't have any pre-existing relationships. But that can be sometimes hard because we don't want like a person who might be a supervisor of another person. If you're trying to get information out of them, you might want to make sure that you are pay attention to who you're inviting to come to your focus group interviews. Make sure the location you're having the focus group at is a nice, easy to find location, and that it's neutral. So it's not like, it's someplace that people can find easily, and it's not like, it's just a neutral location. Again, we usually do tables and chairs because it's just nicer to sit at a table. People feel safer. I also like to provide name tags, and we usually just do first name, like a 3x5 card. You fold it in half. You have the person write their first name on the front and the back of the card. That way people sitting next to them can read the name and they don't feel like they don't know who the person is that is sitting next to them. It's not so the person remembers their own name. It's just so the people sitting next to them can figure out what their name is. Make sure you record in 2 ways, like I said, audio recording, but then also have that assistant moderator taking some notes. You as the moderator would take maybe some notes, but probably minimal notes. Your notes would probably be more along the lines of, you know, what kind of follow-up question do I need to ask, or probing question do I need to ask? The moderator needs to set the tone of the meeting, and T is going to talk a little bit about what an introduction could be to like an interview, like a one-on-one interview. You would use a similar type of introduction here. The other thing is, for a moderator, you need to remember there are no right or wrong answers to focus group interview questions. So it's harder to do, but if you can avoid it, you need to try to not nod your head or shake your head. So if you nod your head in agreement, then and you don't nod your head in agreement to someone else's response, then that might cause a little issue. So make sure that you try to remain neutral in your response to the questions. I mean, pay attention, show them that you're paying attention, but try not to nod or shake your head. There's also 2 techniques that you can use and employ as a moderator. Make sure you use the 5-second pause. That was 5 seconds. It can be an awkward silence for some, but as you ask your questions, you need to make sure that people have the time to process what you've just asked them, because again, we don't want to send our questions ahead of time. So you need them to have time to listen and process and start thinking about what they might respond or answer, or how they might answer. And again, that other technique, the essential technique, is that probing question. So again, you need to listen and make sure you understand what people are telling you so that you can ask follow-up or probing questions. So I couldn't resist the most interesting man in the world. So after your focus group interview, you're going to have a lot of data. And as T said earlier, I believe She and Amy are going to tackle data analysis, qualitative data analysis tomorrow, but just a little bit about it. Today, you're going to have a lot of data from your focus group interviews, all these answers from people. You're going to want to organize these into findings, which are just the words. They're not disputable. This is what was said at your focus group interview. You're also going to have interpretations. So what do those words mean? You should typically try to have more than one person do the analysis so that you can have multiple interpretations. Then you're going to have judgments. And how are we going to put value on the words and the themes that we've identified? And then recommendations. So what are we going to do about all of this information that we've gotten? And again, you're going to analyze and look for major themes that are discussed. And then look for those unique responses. There might be a few unique responses in there. So that was a little bit about focus group interviews, and then reporting of results. I'm sorry, I forgot that last one. So we have all this data, we've analyzed all the data, then we want to report the results. Typically, we try to have multiple different ways to share the results of our focus group interviews. Make sure you consider your audience and how you're going to either write up those results, or maybe you want to do a video of what those results were. Make sure you focus on the important parts, important themes that were identified in those that analysis, and then also try to again do both written reports and oral reports. When we're doing a written report, though, keep in mind that we want to kind of come up with an executive summary or a one-pager. You'll have other people that are interested in your 30-page report, but most people will want to digest only that one-pager. So try to come up with different ways that you can share your information. So before I moved on to the next technique, do we have any questions? Because we're running out of time. And T, I can just do the next one really, really quick if you want me to. Because it's 1:45. Okay, so nominal group technique is the next one that I wanted to discuss. And this one, a lot of you have information because some of you participated in either the fall roadshows that we did, or you participated in the, I think it was SnapEd, Brian, I can't remember what exactly. There was another group that did some nominal group techniques. So this is another way to get a lot of information out of a group of people. We typically want a small group of people involved in this. We have some advantages and disadvantages, and down here in the lower right-hand corner, there is a Go link that you can go and look at the, we have a tip sheet on nominal group technique. But it gives us a good amount of data, again, just like a focus group interview does. It's relatively inexpensive. It can be very quick. We want to make sure that another good advantage of nominal group technique is that you're having the participants do your data analysis for you. You're walking out of that room with a priority list, and that can at least get you started down the road. Whereas some of these other techniques don't offer that to you. So basically, it's a 4-step process, so it's very simple. You need to make sure that you have that nominal question written out, and you share that with people at the beginning, and they generate their own silent, there's a time of silent generation of ideas where they're writing down their own thoughts of an answer to that question. And then you go around the group of people, which we tend to like no more than 10 to 12 people in a nominal group technique as well. Then there's a round robin sharing. And we ask everybody in the group to share what their ideas are on that list of, or that piece of paper. And then we have a round of clarifying the ideas that were shared, and then we have a voting round. So the voting round is where we get to share, 1, 2, 3, 4. What are my top 3, 4 priorities? And then I'm going to turn it back over to T.
Okay. Okay, everybody. We're going to talk quickly about, and you know what, Debbie? I didn't advance my slides, so I'm going to do that real quick. I was engrossed in what Debbie was saying. So hold on one sec. And while I'm doing this, just let me say some of the tips that Debbie talked about. For instance, not nodding your head. I mean, that seems like such a simple tip, doesn't it?
It's hard.
It's hard. Oh my gosh, it's hard. And then
Isn't it,
also,
Jared?
and also, yeah, that 5-second pause, that was very poignant, right? That seems like a long time when you're just sitting there and listening or not listening to anything being said. But
T, do you want me to just keep sharing mine?
yeah, if you wouldn't mind, Debbie, that'd be great.
That's fine. There you go.
Cool. So we're going to talk about key informant interviews. And the, can you go back one slide, Debbie? Are you back?
Yeah, that was my slide.
Okay. So key informant.
Which one are we looking for?
There, I had a definition of key informant.
Oh, it's right here at the bottom.
Okay.
You see it?
No, not yet. But let me just, I'll go ahead and say, you know, when we talk about a key informant interview, a key informant interview is really a purposeful conversation with a knowledgeable person when you want to delve in depth into a topic. And I'll give you some examples of my experience with them. We can do those key informant interviews face-to-face in person. I've done that. We can do face-to-face in person online. I've done that. We could do them by telephone interview. I've done that as well. And then sometimes, depending on your folks that you're going to interview, you might some who say, "Look, I'll do it by telephone. I'm only going to do it by telephone." Or it could be that if somebody is geographically, if it's a good distance from you, you may want to do it by telephone or by Zoom or whatever. When I can, at times I've tried to do in person because I think sometimes that helps to enrich the conversation a little bit. But I will also say this, after the past 2 months with all of us living on Zoom, I'm getting much more comfortable with probably doing key informant interviews via Zoom. Some people don't want to be video. They don't want to be on video, so you might just do audio via Zoom or audio via telephone. All right, Debbie, we can go forward. And I'm not seeing it. Okay. I still don't have it. Okay, I'll tell you what. I'm gonna talk, and then you can switch through. But so the steps with key informant interviews, much like a focus group, you need to determine your purpose, right? What is it that you want to study? And then you're going to write some really good open-ended questions. But I'm going to deviate from that in just a sec. Based on that purpose, you're going to prepare, and you're going to hear Debbie and I say protocol. Prepare your protocol. It's also just a discussion guide. You know, how are you going to do that? It's going to be systematic because you want the same process for all of the people that you're interviewing. You don't want to do this set of questions for this person, another set of questions for another person. You're going to have to select your key informants. We could spend quite a bit of time talking about that, but sometimes your key informants, that's really going to be also determined by the purpose of your study and those persons who are going to be very knowledgeable. So I'll give you an example from my experience of one in 4-H youth development. And you're going to conduct and record those interviews. Again, I do record the interviews when I do those. And then as we talked about with focus groups, the analysis of your data, and then again, presenting it in a digestible format. So selecting key informants, I'm going to tell you all the process that I've used with others when we've done this kind of work is we generally start out with a grid that talks about the groups or organizations that are key informants. For example, with a 4-H educator in the county, we talked about the Farm Bureau being an important existing partner. She also wanted to talk to some new partners. So the health department was one of those new partners that she wanted to talk with. And then from there, we said, we want to talk to the person in the Farm Bureau that's director of youth programs. So we didn't start out by saying, oh, I want to talk to Debbie Lewis. We said, okay, who are the organizations, what positions, what do we need to talk to? Same thing with the health department. Oh, in the health department, we want to talk with the youth outreach coordinator. Well, who's the youth outreach coordinator? And then we identify that person. So we go through a process of determining who key informants are. And then in conducting the interview, you want to be clear about the purpose of what you're doing, the purpose of your study, or the purpose for this key informant interview while you're there. And also, again, Debbie mentioned this, but I want to be clear that I'm going to record the conversation and get the person's permission to record the conversation, and then say, okay, I'm starting to record now, and then telling them when I stop recording. We do start out again with the interviews with building some rapport with an icebreaker question, kind of getting people warmed up for the interview. And then just as with a focus group, we sequence the questions. And we also, both in focus group discussion guides and with key informant guides, we use probes because sometimes you ask a question and what if you don't have a lot of people who are talkers, or maybe they didn't understand your question. And so we kind of probe a little bit, maybe asking the question in a little bit of a different way or a bit of a different dimension. And I'll give you some examples of that. And, you know, when I've conducted interviews, if I don't understand something that someone is trying to get across to me, I will ask for clarification and say, well, help me understand or tell me more about that so that I'm understanding what the person's trying to tell me. And then as with the focus group, staying neutral and listening carefully. It is an interview, and my job is to let that person do the talking and, you know, only talk when I need to ask the question or provide further clarification. So here's an example of some introductory text from an actual protocol discussion guide we did. You know, good morning, good afternoon. You know, thank you for taking your valuable time to talk with me. And here's the purpose. We're going to talk about the needs, challenges, and opportunities of 4-H in this county. If it's IRB, we're going to go over the informed consent. And then as I said, it's important, I always tell the person, okay, I'm going to record, now I'm recording, let's get started. This is an example. This was an aggressive interview in terms of the amount of information. You heard Debbie say, you know, 6, maybe 7 questions. There were 10 questions, and it was a lot. These interviews ranged from about 45 minutes easily to 60 minutes. And this educator was a person who, she was new in the job. The position had been vacant for a while. She needed to go out and make some connections in the community. And by doing these key informant interviews, not only did she get information from the people in the community, but they got to know her. And so we talked about that for a while between us. You know, it was a really good marketing piece for her as a new educator. So that was, you know, yes, it was a lot of work, but there were multiple products that she came out of with those key informant interviews with. And as she could go to their office, she went to their office so she could see where they're at and so forth. And she gave them a little bit of information about the 4-H program. So she talked with new partners and existing partners, and got a lot of great information. So asking open-ended questions. So I have to tell you all this, even though we're running out of time. Amy O'Hadi and I were talking yesterday, and she said, good questions equal good data. And I said, Amy O'Hadi, I'm writing that down, and I'm gonna put it on my slides for tomorrow. And that is so true. And so we have closed questions, closed-ended questions, which we tend to use more of course, in surveys. I don't know if any of you have ever received a survey with about 12 open-ended questions. I tend to just shut those down because I can't deal with it mentally. But here's an example. How often do you like to eat potato chips? Just making that up. And you see there's a scale there where I have predetermined the answers with a closed-ended question versus an open-ended question where I haven't predetermined what the response would be. It is the respondent is giving me the response. And so they tend to be questions like, what is it about potato chips that make you want to eat them every day? Or please describe your favorite kind of potato chip. So you can see the difference there. Had some examples here. I was going to let you guess a little bit on open or closed. And we're not going to do that. We're not going to walk through each one of those. But let me just tell you, sometimes some of these that I gave that are in the example, they could be closed-ended or they could be open-ended. For example, number 5, Number 6, what types of programs or classes would you like to see offered through Ohio State University Extension? You could leave it at that. It could be a completely open-ended question. Or I could decide that I know enough about the types of programs or classes where I'm going to create some check boxes for people to check off, and then I'm going to put other. We have used both in a focus group and in a key informant interview. We have built in closed-ended questions, some quantitative data into the interview or the focus group. And in this example, one of the questions was about midway through, how important do you think these topics are for youth in Buckeye County? And we had a scale, and we said what the scale was on a scale of 1 to 4. And then the educator had their piece of paper there, and they recorded the answers to those questions. I said we're going to talk a little bit about probes. This is a big, broad question that we asked. If you had $100,000 to grow a new 4-H youth development program in Buckeye County, what would it look like? And so, wow, that's pretty big. So a probe there is like, oh, well, where would you get started? Well, who would be involved? Where should the program expand to remain relevant? So those are what we call probing type questions. So just final thoughts on all of this. Really in our communities and extension work that we do, needs assessments and assets inventories. And you're going to hear Amy O'Hady talk more about the assets-based inventories. They're ongoing work. Even if we've been in the community for 20 years, there are times when we need to go back and touch base with our existing clientele. Their needs change, assets change, or to make sure they're reaching out to those underrepresented or underserved audiences that may have moved into our community that we haven't typically worked with. So it's an ongoing process. Here's a really critical point that I want to leave you all with. You can collect primary data, your information at a scope that you can handle. Remember, it's back to that continuum. Please don't leave here and say, Debbie and T said you had to do a 6-month research-based project on the needs of your community. There's multiple ways to handle that based on the resources that you have. And again, these methods will allow you to reach audiences that you may have not reached in the past, could be underrepresented. But we want you to be systematic in your process, whichever ones you use, and we want you to be able to use the data. And finally, a shameless commercial from me. I worked last year with the Extension on an evaluation e-field book, and going to be working again this year with the new oncoming author as we make the transition. John Diaz from Florida will be helping me to expand this, but you can go there and get more information. I also wanted to tell you that there's some great resources on the community toolbox. If you haven't used it, it's out of Kansas. I just put that link in there for you. Go take a look at that. And with that, we're done. Any questions before you hop off? I would be really curious as you're leaving, if anybody is, if you're interested in doing some focus group or listening session moderator trainings, just type into the chat box. I'm doing a survey real quick. Thank you all for being here today.
Yes, thank you.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.